Hi everybody, Ronan here, and we now have the 3.8 Phase 2 banners. Of course, we knew 5 stars, Kokomi and Wanderer, but now we have confirmation of the 4 stars, Baruzan, Rosaria, and Yanfei. For longer term players, this is probably a bit painful. I'd imagine a lot of people will have Rosaria and Yanfei at C6 by now. For Wanderer or Xiaomains, it's not so bad. If you're going for C6 Farazan, you've already got C6 Rosaria and C6 Yanfei, so you'll get a wish refunded every temple if you get one. Could be better, could be worse. I'd like to see Hoyo balance the 4-star rate ups a bit better between older and newer characters. I think that might change a little with Fontaine, given the amount of new characters we'll be getting. We'll see. All speculation, along with the triple banners and pick'em banners and who knows what else. Let's dig into the characters as usual. This is going to be quite a tough one for me because I really, really don't like Wanderer. Trying to stay positive about a character who you really don't rate is kind of difficult, but I think I've managed it. So let's start with the controversial one, Wanderer. For me, Wanderer is underrated as a max investment unit. So with high constellations, with a high refinement weapon, if you are a Wanderer main and you can throw everything you have into making him the most powerful version of himself, damage output wise, he's really good. On the flip side of that, as a free to play unit, he's massively overrated. I think there are only a handful of YouTubers out there who are actually quite honest with his power level if you're a free to play player, because he requires a lot to do respectable damage. And one of the things he requires to do respectable damage is a C6 Farazan. Now, Farazan's main buffing is available at C0, but her ER requirements are so ridiculously high that she's pretty much unplayable until you get her C6. On top of this requirement for a high constellation 4-star, there's so much contradictory information out there for Wanderer builds. The amount of YouTubers that say his best playstyle is charge attack and then say to have his signature weapon, it's ridiculous. His signature weapon just buffs normal attacks. It does nothing for his charge attack playstyle. And that's just one of the what the fuck moments I've seen from Genshin YouTubers since Wanderer's release. If you're still watching, listening, let's take a good, honest look at Wanderer, how he plays, and if he's worth pulling at C0. There are 3 different ways to play him, and the way you play him affects pretty much everything other than his artifact set. It even affects the team you run him in. Those 3 playstyles are charge attack spam, normal attack spam, and then using a attack during combo. So that would be N2 scene, 2 normal attacks plus a charge attack. If you are a Uber Wanderer main and you're going to get his signature weapon, then you're almost forced into the normal attack spam playstyle. If you're not going to do the normal attack spam playstyle, his signature weapon is nowhere near his best in slot, which is another issue with Wanderer's design. His playstyle is honestly what I think really holds him back from being a good character. How he plays severely limits him in terms of teams he can be running, weapons he can use, artifacts he can use. In my opinion, taking numbers out of it, combat wise, his kit is up there with Deha's as being the worst design kit. And the main reason for that is his complete lack of resistance to interruption. If you're in that flying, hovering state and you get hit, it costs you so much momentum, so much damage, because you have to have the falling animation followed by his rising back up animation. If you compare that to someone like Yoimiya, who also needs a shit ton of resistance to interruption, at least with Yoimiya, if you get hit, yes, it's broken your attack string, but you can pretty much immediately start attacking again. With Wanderer, it takes a couple of seconds, and that couple of seconds is a hell of a lot of time if you're trying to 36 star your base. While on paper, you don't lose as much damage as getting knocked out of your full 5 NA string. Because of that time loss, it's worse, I think. Yes, you can dodge while you're in the air, and as long as you have that descent effect, you don't lose any points for dodging and you get the extra damage. Don't dodge weave, by the way. It's actually a net damage loss to weave dashes in. But that descent effect is RNG. So yes, the chance of you getting it goes up with each normal and charge attack, but it's still RNG. And with how aggressive mobs are getting now, the chances of you having that descent effect up every time you need to dodge, zero. Absolutely zero. So he needs a shield or he have resistance to interruption. You're far better off keeping that descent buff as a get out of jail free card for if your shield has been broken, and not using it as a replacement for a shield. So with requirements in mind, let's have a quick look at his teams. So you're going to absolutely need Farazan. If you want to play Wanderer as he's intended, as a hyper carry, you need Farazan. Absolutely need Farazan. Then the other two slots, you ideally want to be looking at his elemental passive. And there's only two of the buffs from his elemental passive that are actually worth using. And that is Pyro and Cryo buffs. The Hydro buff on paper looks great. Extending his in-air time looks great. But by the time you get to those couple of seconds that Hydro buff has granted you, all his team buffs are gone. So it's absolutely pointless. You actually lose damage, you lose DPS by having that buff, not gain DPS on Wanderer. The Electro buff, again, absolutely pointless. His burst isn't high enough cost to warrant it. And as cool as his burst looks, it's not the best damage output in his kit. If anything, his burst is his lowest priority skill for leveling up. So that leaves us with Pyro and Cryo. Of the two buffs, I think the Cryo buff is the better buff. Cryo buff is the better buff. Because it's crit. Crit is king in Genshin. And let's face it, no one has perfect crit ratio artifacts. So having a guaranteed 20% crit just for being in the air, beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. Luckily, with Cryo comes two very, very nice shielders in Layla and in Diona. If you can invest in Layla, Layla's shield is amazing. And Layla can output reasonable damage, all things considered. Me personally, I pick Layla of the two. But if you're willing to sacrifice that off-field damage with decent investment, Diona's shield can also be pretty good. And you have the comfort of Diona being a healer. Your other option for the cryo is actually on the banner. Rosaria, with her crit buff, can be a phenomenal partner for Wanderer. There's a few more things that make Rosaria great and a very underrated character, but we'll get into that when we get to talking about her. The final slot on your team is very, very flexible, actually. So, me personally, for consistency, Bennett with him, but that's also because I also like to run Layla. But obviously, if you're running Diona, you don't need a second healer, so you don't need Bennett. A lot of people won't want to run a healer and a shielder, so in that case, I would drop Bennett, and your last pick then comes down to, are you going to charge attack or are you going to normal attack? If you're going to charge attack and you want a pyro character, then just run Xiangling, plain and simple. Xiangling's damage output probably far exceeds the buffing capabilities of any pyro character not named Bennett. If you're not going to go with charge attacks, then your fourth slot should probably be Yunjin. Something I've noticed in my Yoimiya team is that Yunjin, when built well, is not that far behind Bennett in terms of buffing for characters that are very much normal attack based. Obviously, with her buff, you don't get snapshotting for other characters on your team, but in terms of buffing your carry, Yunjin's not far behind. Now, another completely out there option, and this very much depends on your level of investment in this completely out there option. But if you're doing the normal attack spam and you really only want the resistance to interruption, you can run Toma. Toma performs very, very well with Wanderer. His shield in encounters with large numbers of enemies isn't the best. Some of the more aggressive waves in the Abyss, and to be honest, in the Overworld in some areas, because even in the Overworld, some of the enemies can get super, super aggressive. And his shield in those encounters isn't the best. Unless you've managed to get up a few stacks, it's gonna break really quickly. But it's also going to allow you to tank a few hits, which in chambers with only 2 or 3 enemies, you're probably going to be all right. And the reason I mention investment level is because if you've managed to get a C6 Toma, he has a normal attack buff in his kit. So you sacrifice a little bit of the buff from Yunjin to get resistance to interruption. And that then allows you to run Rosaria as cryo unit, which gives you extra crit, allowing you to be a little more forgiving with your artifacts. Biggest takeaway from the team building really is that yes, he's got quite strict team requirements, but there are options within those requirements. Now we've gone over the teams, let's have a quick look at his weapon and artifact options. Because of his playstyle and his kit, the way his kit works, his weapons outside of 5 stars fucking suck. Absolutely suck. He doesn't like EM as much as more characters because Swirl doesn't make up a high enough percentage of his damage. He doesn't benefit from ER because his burst isn't particularly high cost and isn't particularly high value within his kit, which leaves us with attack percent and crit weapons. And if you're running in with Bennett, the attack percent weapons lose quite a bit of their value because of diminishing returns. And to be honest with you, the 4 stars, very few of them actually have passives that synergize well with his kit. As usual, I won't cover 5 stars because the weapon banner is a scam. But if you plan on using charge attacks with him, then Lost Prayer is probably his best. Outside of that, probably his signature, but it won't work on anyone else. And to be honest with you, it's not far enough ahead of other options to be worth the primos. Go dig out a guide, probably Kagura's Verity. From what I saw in research, Kagura's Verity probably the best 5-star catalyst you can go for, because it synergizes with Wanderer fairly well, and it works on a lot of other characters. So if you want to charge attack spam, then Skyward Atlas, if you've been lucky on the standard banner, is probably the best weapon. To be honest, it's probably his best weapon for normal attack spam as well. Wanderer does love attack percent, but as I said, with Bennett in the team, you get diminishing returns on the attack. So just be mindful of that. For 4 stars, if you've bought the Battle Pass and you have it, Solar Pearl is really, really nice on him. Oh, the buff lasts 6 seconds. Wanderer's E lasts 10 seconds. It's consistent. If you have to dash, you lose a couple of seconds. You're going to hit his burst around the 9-second mark to get max damage out of his burst. So you're not losing huge amount, probably 2 seconds of buff time. I'll take that for consistency, especially when the crit rate substat's always nice. Outside of that, Widsith is probably the best free-to-play option for him. Personally, I hate that weapon, and I don't like people recommending it, because for me, it's the biggest whale weapon out there. It's a bigger whale weapon than any of the 5 stars, because the buff only lasts 10 seconds. So to actually make use of it properly, you need enough investment to kill everything in the chamber in 10 seconds, because it only lasts 10 seconds. Wanderer in particular only wants 2 of the 3 buffs. So if you start the chamber and you've got the EM buff, you're going to restart. And you're going to keep restarting until you get that buff. But then if you can't nuke everything in 10 seconds, the buff is then gone for 20 seconds. So you're only getting the buff every other rotation. To me, that isn't worth it. Now, the crit damage substat is good. And if you're running him in a team with Rosaria, then the crit damage substat is probably going to be more valuable than the crit rate you'd get from something like a Solar Pearl. If you are going charge attack and you've been around long enough to have it, Dodoko Tails is amazing. And ironically, Eye of Perception is a really good weapon for him. It's got a slightly lower base attack than Skyward Atlas, but it's got a higher attack percentage. You don't have the elemental damage bonus, but that extra damage instance you get can trigger every 12 seconds instead of every 30 seconds. So as a 4-star versus 5-star weapon where you don't really care that much about the passive, Perception's not bad. It's not bad at all. If you are running him correctly, as in running him with a cryo character, Frostbearer is actually a surprisingly good option. A couple of the others that I see thrown around a bit, Mapamara, it's okay. EM isn't amazing for him, but he does swirl enough that it's not completely wasted. And he is one of the few characters that can quite easily get the 2 stacks on it. So 16% elemental damage bonus is pretty nice. The Black Cliff, on the other hand, is just a worse Widsith. There's better things to spend your Stardust on. Artifacts wise, his signature set is obviously his best, but it's in a domain where the second set, Flower of Paradise Lost, or Flop, as some people like to call it, isn't a significant enough upgrade over Gilded to make it worth the resin to farm. If you want to be resin efficient and be able to farm for Wanderer plus upgrades for other characters, then Shiminawa's isn't that far behind. You lose the 15% animal damage buff, getting 18% attack instead, which, as we've already mentioned, kind of got diminishing returns. The buff triggers on casting his skill, which is probably more synergistic than his signature set, which triggers on using a charge attack. people will say, oh, you gotta have 15 energy, blah blah. By the time you've come around to actually casting his skill, if you don't have 15 energy, you're doing something wrong. And the buff to his normal and charge attacks is actually 10% stronger than his signature set. But you lose the attack speed buff, which people say is pretty big for Wanderer. I don't really think it is, but be aware of it. All in all, even taking my extreme dislike of Wanderer as a story character and a playable character, without decent investment on him and his team, is very underwhelming. C0 Wanderer with anything other than a C6 Pharazan is incredibly painful to play and very difficult to build. You absolutely have to have a shielder or good resistance to interruption. Sting Show isn't enough. He has overall less damage output than someone like Yoimiya. So him getting interrupted and getting knocked out of his combos hurts him and his teams massively. Don't get his signature weapon. Do get C6 Pharazan. Do run him with the shielder. Don't run him with his signature artifact set. Run him with Shimenawa's. Probably it. Overall, the only reason to pull for Wanderer outside of loving his character is for the overworld, which I'll admit is pretty cool flying around. But my god, is that a lot to pay just to make the already fairly easy overworld even easier. For me, don't pull. Ever. Kokomi, the fish. Honestly, there's really not much to say about Kokomi. She's, in my opinion, the best healer in the game. She's so splashable onto so many different teams. Sure, her lower off-field hydro application isn't great for some teams, but it's absolutely perfect for others. There, in my opinion, aren't many better on-field drivers for Hyperbloom teams. I've tried quite a few different team setups for Hyperbloom, and of all of them, my favorite is Kokomi. I even tried Mona, and to be honest, Mona's pretty good. She's an absolutely amazing option in freeze teams where her slower hydro application is actually really good and really useful. And in a lot of freeze teams, playing circle impact like that in around her jellyfish doesn't harm you too much. I've actually used her in taser teams as well as an on-field driver, mostly just out of fun because I wanted to test it, and it's actually surprisingly good because units like Raiden and Official deal so much off-field electro damage. You have a near unkillable taser team with surprisingly high damage. But off-field in that sort of team, she's not good. Don't do it. You could honestly go on for hours in the various teams and team archetypes that she works in. If your team needs Hydro and you need a healer, you need Kokomi. Simple. For weapons and artifacts, she's kind of limited, but honestly, that's more to do with just how good some weapons and artifacts are for her, rather than her kit being restrictive on what weapons and artifacts you can use. So if you're using her off-field, then Tenacity in the middle left is her best artifact set. It's got the 2-piece HP percent, which boosts her healing, boosts her fairly limited damage output, and provides your team with a really nice attack buff. You can go with Clam if you've got somebody else providing buffs, but people forget that Tenacity and Noblesse stack. So I don't see why off-field you would use Clam over Tenacity. And if they've changed that fact and Tenacity and Noblesse can't stack anymore, then your Noblesse user probably benefit more from a different set than off-field Kokomi would benefit from Clam. On-field, however, where you are going to be using her burst and you are going to be getting that massive amount of overhealing, Clam is amazing. And it is kind of hard to overlook that as an on-field driver. But Heart of Depths is actually very, very good. You almost always start her field time with her E, so having 15 seconds of boosting her usually pretty weak normal attack damage outside of her burst is great, because most of the time you don't need the extra healing from the two-piece clam, and while the chunk damage that you get from clam procs is pretty good, it's not always that noticeable. I need to do a bit more testing on the exact difference between clam and Heart of Depths, but so for now, just be aware it is an option, but I wouldn't feel right saying if you're running on field Kokomi, Heart of Depths is brilliant, use it. Just be aware that it's there and you can use it. And honestly, that I don't normally like talking about constellations on characters, but I do feel it's worth mentioning. For the most part, Kokomi's constellations are utterly worthless. C1 is not bad. It functions kind of similarly to Clam in that at a certain point sends out a fish, which looks really, really cool, that deals 30% of her HP as hydro damage. But based on that, only triggers on the final normal attack in her combo, which for 90% of players, you're never going to do. If you're on fielding her, normally you're using N2C. You're only doing 2 of the 3 attacks. And if you're off fielding her, then you're never going to see it. C2 just boosts her healing, and her healing's already incredible. C4 isn't bad. It increases her attack speed, which is great if you're on fielding her. And the energy restoration is pretty nice, but it's pretty underwhelming. You don't really need the extra energy, and you don't really need the normal attack speed. Her C6, however, is great for her as an on-field driver, but it's a C6. There aren't many C6s out there that are bad, and the rest of these, being as bad as they are, very much devalue her C6. Kind of wraps up everything there is to say about Kokomi. She's pretty much as close to a must-pull character as you can get outside of Kazuha and Nahida. She's one of the most versatile in terms of team, because she's a healer, she's got decent hydro application, she could be an on-field driver, she's very splashable to many, many teams. Sure, her damage output is kind of lacking, but the versatility she provides and the fact that in her burst she's nigh on unkillable make her phenomenal pick for any account. Now, let's move on to the 4 stars. Again, let's get the controversial one out of the way first. Farazan, absolute garbage unless you have her C6. And that's not because she needs the buff. It's because she needs the energy that comes from her charge attack effect triggering within her burst. So let's explain a little bit better. The only way Farazan has to generate particles is through this mechanic called pressurized collapse. Pressurized collapse activates when you create this hurricane arrow. Hurricane arrow is what happens when you do a charged attack after casting her E. It's kind of long-winded explanation to say the only way she generates energy is by charge attacking after her E has been activated. Now, her C6 has this wonderful extra passive in it. When the active character deals damage while affected by Prayerful Wind's benefit, they will apply pressurized collapse to the opponent's damaged. This effect can be triggered once every 3 seconds. Prayerful Wind's benefit is the animal damage buff you get from her burst. What this means is that every 3 seconds, while her burst is active, if the active character deals damage, it triggers the effect that grants her energy, which essentially means that with C6, her energy requirements absolutely plummet, because every 3 seconds during her 12-second burst, she can generate on average 2 particles. So not only is that C6 amazing for her, that C6 is also amazing for someone like a Xiao. The energy generation isn't so worthwhile for Wanderer because his burst isn't as necessary for him to do damage. But without that C6, you're hard tied to charge attacking after every E, and she doesn't have any kind of quick charge mechanic. So you're talking she needs probably 4 seconds of field time every rotation, which extends all of your rotations. And even then, she still needs probably around 280 to 300% energy recharge just to get her burst on cooldown. Now, to some people, that might not seem a huge amount, but when you think a level 90 Fav bow gives you 62% ER, a level 20 ER Sans is 52%, plus your base ER of 100%, the only surefire way, the only sure amount of ER you can get is 214%. You need to find 70% minimum energy recharge from substats. Now you can mitigate that by having another Fav user on the team, but even then, that doesn't reduce those ER requirements a huge amount per C6. I used to think that her C4 was pretty good, but it's only good in AoE. So with C4, no charge attack after E or 1 for boss fights will give you 2 animal particles plus 2 energy up to a maximum of, I think that pressurized collapse can generate 2 or 3 particles. So max you're getting 3 particles plus 4 energy, which isn't actually a lot when you take into account her burst is an 80 cost. So generating 4 energy out of 80 is nothing. So effectively, at C0, she's almost unusable. At C6, however, you will not get a better unit for Xiao, Wanderer, or if you're me, Hazo. But the problem with that C6 is, without being a whale, the odds of having a C6 Pharazan before this banner lands are almost none. And the odds of you getting even 2 copies of Pharazan on this banner are quite slim. I've seen a few lucky people already, because me being me, this video is coming out late. But overall, C0 Pharazan, one of the worst characters in the game. C6 Pharazan, one of the best niche buffers in the game. And there isn't really a middle ground. Let's move on to Rosaria. Now, Rosaria, for me, is a criminally overlooked character. She's actually great, but she's been power crept quite a bit, I think. She's a very, very good cryo battery. Because her skill and her burst hit twice, she has, in a rotation, 4 chances to proc Favlance, which for kind of energy hungry cryo characters like Ayaka, like Eula, is really, really useful. And the fact that her burst gives a up to 15% crit rate buff for any character stood in it is amazing. So if you can get 100% crit rate on Rosaria, that's 15% crit rate from Rosaria's buff, 15% from Cryo Resonance, and then in a freeze team, you're getting another 40% on your carry from Blizzard. That's 70% crit rate before taking into account artifacts. So with Rosaria in your team, you can almost completely ignore crit rate on your artifacts for someone like an Ayaka, which is absolutely insane to me. Yes, she's not the highest damage off-field cryo unit. As a free-to-play, you're fairly limited in your options for your second cryo unit. Diona, she's a nice healer, but she deals even less damage off-field than Rosaria. You've got Layla, who, in my testing, is actually pretty solid, but her damage output doesn't eclipse Rosaria's, and her cryo application is tied to her shield being up. So outside of 5 stars, Rosaria is actually in my opinion, one of the best cryo units you can use if you need an off-field cryo character. She's actually incredibly easy to build as well. Give her a Fab Lance, give her Noblesse, ignore her normals. To be honest, ignore her E as well, unless you have the resources. You only need ER and crit rate on her. Constellation wise, unless you're playing her in a physical team, which, let's face it, physical's bad, you don't really need constellations on her to make her work either. Her C2 is amazing because it extends the duration of her burst. Without her C2, her burst has got, give or take, a 50% uptime. With her C2, it's now 12 seconds with a 15-second cooldown, so you're only missing 3 seconds of burst uptime. The C4 is very nice to have because if you built her with 100% crit, her E always crits. Because her E always crits, you get 5 energy Rosaria, plus you've got a 60-40 chance of a Fav proc as well. So, very nice, but not absolutely necessary. You only really need her C2. All in all, Rosaria, great pickup if you haven't got her already. Good to pull up to at least C4, but only really her C2 is absolutely worthwhile. Yanfei. I've been waiting for Yanfei to come around because a friend of mine has got me playing a bit more Yanfei recently. She absolutely loves Yanfei and wanted some tips on building and playing Yanfei. So Yanfei is really fun and unique to play. The problem is she falls off hard compared to other Pyro DPS. You cannot compare Yanfei to the likes of Hu Tao or Yoimiya. It's an unfair comparison. As a 4-star DPS, I find her to be one of the best. Her charge attack playstyle can feel a little clunky to start with, but once you get used to it, you start enjoying her a lot more, and because you're enjoying her a lot more, damage seems to go up. Her playstyle revolves around this Scarlet Seal mechanic, and there's 3 ways to gain these Scarlet Seals. A normal attack gives 1 seal, her E gives her the maximum 3 seals, and her burst also gives the maximum 3 seals, but grants her a new seal every 1 second for 15 seconds. So you build her with enough ER to make sure you've got your burst on cooldown, set up all your other characters, then you go E, charge attack, burst, and then you charge attack, spam until either her burst expires or you need to reset your off-field buffs. Because she doesn't have a mechanic that increases the charge time of her charge attacks, you're almost always going to have at least 2, sometimes 3 seals active when you come to getting your next charge attack off. So you're always going to be getting the maximum damage out of her charge attacks. I think one of the main issues that people have with Yanfei is the fact that she's not the easiest to team build around. Vape teams would be her best, but because she is a charge attack character, she can't use either Yalan or Singshot, who are the 2 best off-field hydro damage dealers. However, being a charge attack character, she doesn't necessarily need fast hydro application. So someone like a Kokomi can work really, really well. Kokomi gives you that slow hydro application plus healing. So you kind of have to go all in on bumping up Yanfei's damage and almost playing her as a hyper carry. For that reason, I actually like running Mona with her. Mona gives you the slow hydro so you can vape every charge attack on Yanfei, and you get the massive damage boost from Mona's burst, which also works really well with Yanfei. So team I've been running her in for testing and learning how she plays is Yanfei, Mona, then Bennett, second Pyro, great attack buff, healer, kind of a given. And then you can either go with Sucrose or Kazuha. Personally, I actually enjoyed Sucrose, but obviously in this style of team, Kazuha is going to be better. The other team I played her in that I quite enjoyed was Melt. Because because she's a charge attack DPS, she can benefit from the 15% crit rate boost of Cryo Resonance. I was actually messing around with Yanfei, Rosaria, Ona, Sucrose as a team. I didn't get a huge amount of testing in on it, but it was certainly a lot of fun and did a surprising amount of damage. So you've got shielding and healing from Diona, which the resistance to interruption is really, really nice on Yanfei because getting knocked out of her charge attacks is painful. Rosaria's burst has got good cryo application plus another crit rate buff, which then gives you 30% crit rate for Yanfei, allowing you to forego a lot of crit rate on artifacts. Build wise, she's got a lot of different options, and free to play is pretty easy to get a good build going. Map and Mara is really good on her, since both Vape and Melt benefit from EM, and she's on the field long enough to get the 2 stacks. Dodoko Tails, if you've got it, is a good option for her. Almost any of the crit weapons will work. So she's got quite a few weapon options, but unless you're wanting to heavily invest in your Yanfei, I'd honestly just run Mapamara or Dodoko Tails if you have it. Artifacts, again, she has options, but there's 2 that are kind of head and shoulders above the rest, and those being Crimson Witch, which Pyro DPS, Pyro artifact set, pretty obvious, and Wanderer's Troop. Again, Vape, Melt, they benefit from EM, and Wanderer's Troop is a charge attack buff. Crimson is probably her best in slot, but I don't think Wanderers would be that far behind. And kind of wraps up 3.8, and with it, phase 3, patch 3, I don't know what you'd call it, 3.x of Genshin. Next up, we'll have 4.0, and I'm really not sure how to do a 4.0 banner review. Do I want to talk about leaks? Do I not? I'm probably going to have to do a lot of research on Linny, Lynette, Fremine, the new Fontaine characters, and decide whether I want to talk about leaks in the review or not. I think I probably will, and I'll just have to put a spoiler warning on it. But by the time I come around to doing the banner review, most of the information for all 3 characters will be out there anyway, thanks to the live stream. So we'll see. I'll have a think of how I want to go about doing a 4.0 banner review, given the amount of new characters that are going to be on it. With that, goodbye to you, goodbye to Sumeru, and I'll see you all in Fontaine.